Good morning, everyone. It is 9:15. You're all in a state of caffeination and high excitement. Welcome to the Tower Centre's very first research conference. Thank you very much indeed for all making it up here, particularly on what I believe is known as a summer Friday. I am Emily Bell, the director of the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism here at Columbia. As I say, this is our first research conference, Quantifying Journalism, Data, Metrics and Computation. It's been quite a year here at the Tower Centre. We've had dozens of events. We've had a new fellows program. This is our first year of really sort of ramped up publication and research. And it's fantastic to see a community like this one coming into the school to discuss what we think are emerging important trends that have a direct impact on journalism. And it's particularly great to see such a good blend of academics and practitioners. And who says that they can't ever get on? I'd like to think that we have disproved that. And I also want to thank everybody here who works for a news organization who has let our researchers talk to you, sit in your newsrooms, interrogate your practices, look at your data, because it really does make such a huge difference to the type of research that we can put back into both the practice of journalism and indeed into the classroom when we're teaching all those journalists that we release annually out into the wild. I just want to thank briefly three very important groups of people. First of all, I want to thank our funders. I want to thank the Tower Foundation and the Knight Foundation, who really took a chance on us a couple of years back when we said we wanted to start this research program, but we wanted it to be experimental, we wanted it to be academic, we wanted it to be practical, and they have not just provided the wherewithal for us to bring such a great group of people together, but actually they've been incredibly good partners in terms of helping us with networks and access and supporting and guiding our work. So they have been excellent funders and partners in this. The second group are the Tower Fellows. If there are many of them here today. What you'll see today is their work. We have 3 major reports launching today, which our research director, Taylor Owen, will tell you about in a moment. And they've really sort of pulled this program together. Again, they're a new cohort for the school. They're fantastic people to have here discussing journalism and driving us forward. And the third group are Team Tow. We're a Team Tow. Here's one of them. This is Taylor Owen, our research director. We have Shawani New Payne, who is over there on the live stream. It's her last day today. And we have Lauren Mack at the back, who literally does everything, without whom none of this would happen. I would not have got out of bed this morning without Lauren being here. And that's quite a high bar, let me tell you. So I want to thank them, and thank you very much indeed for coming here and engaging in what we do. If you want to get involved with the Tower Centre, you like the work, you have a proposal, you're interested in research questions around the things that we do, please get in touch. Contact me, contact Taylor, go to our website, towercentre.org, and hopefully this year, if you have one of those ideas that's particularly good, you may find it debated, presented, and published up here. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Taylor, who will outline the day for you. Thank you very much.
I'm just being reminded that we need to talk about the hashtag, being a center of digital journalism. Tow Talk, I think is our hashtag. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we've been doing for the last year and a half and what we're planning on doing for the day here. Our task for this research program has really been to bring together practitioners, technologists, and interdisciplinary academics to look at how digital technology is changing journalism. And any people in each of those 3 groups will know that bringing them together on projects collaboratively for a year is not an easy task. But I think, as you'll see through the day, some of the projects that have really managed to do that in an effective way. And we're pretty excited to share some of them with you. So for the first research conference, what we wanted to do was bring together our projects on focusing on data journalism. So we have various streams of research, but a number of our projects all in various ways focus on data. And that's what we sort of brought together today. We're launching 3 reports, one by, which I'll introduce later on through the day, but one by Alex Howard on the state and practice of data journalism, one by Claire Wardle and Sam Dubberly on user-generated content, and one by Fergus Pitt, another of our fellows on censor journalism. We're then going to, we've asked 3 of our fellows to run panels through the day. So one, the first, which we're going to open with now, is by Caitlin Petre. It's on the use of metrics in newsrooms. Jonathan Stray, is a fellow computational journalism fellow here, will be doing one on data and computational journalism. And Fergus will do one at the end of the day on robotics and sensors in newsrooms. At lunch, we're going to preview some of our projects that are ongoing. We have presentations from 4 or so fellows who have ongoing projects that will give short talks over lunch. So it's a packed day. I'm going to ask all panels. I'm going to be sitting in the front with time cards to keep things going. We're going to try and get you through the day and out on time. And to start, I want to invite Caitlin and the panel to come up. Caitlin is a sociology PhD student at NYU who's been working with us for the last year on an ethnography project studying the use of metrics tools by journalists, editors, and newsrooms generally. That project will be coming out in the fall, and we'll be having an event conference on the use of metrics in the fall. And I will welcome Caitlin to introduce our panel. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. It's really exciting to see such a big crowd, and I'm excited to get started on the panel. So I'm going to just do brief introductions of the panelists because we have very little time, but you can find longer bios in your programs. So first is James Robinson. James is the very first director of news analytics at the New York Times, where he helps journalists and editors use audience insights to produce, promote, and publish the Times Online. And before joining the Times, I think this is so cool, he built and ran baseballlibrary.com, which aggregated dozens of print baseball reference books into a 20,000-page hypertext narrative of baseball history. Then next to James is Tony Haile. Tony is the Chief Executive Officer of Chartbeat, the real-time data science and analytics company, which works with 4,000 media companies around the world. Tony's also an adjunct professor of journalism right here at the Columbia Journalism School. And prior to entering the startup world, Tony competed in a round-the-world yacht race and managed polar expeditions in the Arctic. I feel like we need another panel just to like dig into that and the baseball library, but some other time. And then finally, we have Daniel Mintz, who's the director of business intelligence at Upworthy. Upworthy, as many of you likely know, has built an enormous audience in a very short period of time, partly by using sophisticated analytics and A/B testing to shape the packaging of his content. And Daniel's been at the forefront of that effort. He also is a frequent presenter at venues like eMetrics, Netroots Nation, Roots Camp, and Yale Law School. So thank you all for being here today, and I'm really excited to dig into some of these issues. I'll begin by saying a little bit about why we wanted to sort of hold this panel. I've been spending the last year, or the last couple years, talking to and observing folks both in the analytics industry and then also in online newsrooms for my research, and I've been struck by the fact that even as we're still sort of having this debate about whether metrics are good for journalism or bad for journalism, do they cause clickbait and listicles and cat pictures, or do they cause journalists to be more in touch with their audiences? Even as that debate is sort of still going on, the fact is that nearly every newsroom is using at least one and usually many of these analytics tools to do their work every single day. And so by focusing sort of on this clickbait debate, I think we have run the risk of sort of losing a lot of the nuance of how news organizations are actually using this data in their day-to-day practice. So that's one of the things and one of the reasons that I kind of wanted to bring these folks together to talk about this, because we see these organizations using the same tools and doing incredibly different things with them. Some are structuring pay incentives around analytics. Some would, never want to do that. Others are sort of restricting access to analytics to only editors. Some are, asking reporters to really keep an eye on their numbers and be responsible for bringing them up. So we see this vast diversity of practices. and I kind of wanted to dig into those. So the first goal that I think we have for this panel is to sort of start to map the landscape of how different types of organizations are really using analytics in practice. And the second is to sort of take a step back and wrestle with kind of some of the more nuanced questions about metrics. So the challenges of interpreting metrics, of drawing insights and understanding from data, the challenges of designing and developing metrics for a field that's as complex and multifaceted as journalism is, and then the effects that metrics are having on journalists' relationship to their work and to their employers and to each other. So without further ado, to accomplish sort of the first goal, I'm going to invite Tony to talk a bit based on Chartbeat's experiences working with 80% of the top publishers in the US and in many countries around the world.
I need to sell myself. Sorry.
What are you finding? What are you seeing? What seems sort of salient to you?
Okay. One, thank you all very much for coming here to the Clash at Columbia. I find myself a nervous fulcrum between the New York Times and Upworthy, a jester dwarfed by intellects on either side. So I'm gonna speak briefly about kind of some overarching things that we've seen in the space, and then try and get as swiftly as possible for us all, I think, to the debate, and then questions from you guys, because I think that's where the fun stuff will really happen. So I want to talk about kind of, I guess, three things. One is like how the hell analytics even got into newsrooms in the first place and why. Secondly, the kind of move from traffic to audience. And thirdly, kind of maybe a hopeful note about where we're going in the future with regards to the kind of metrics we use and how. So we didn't always have metrics in the newsroom. This was still a relatively recent thing, and there's a reasonable question to say why. And I think if we look at the kind of purpose of kind of traditional historical analytics, it was to understand what had happened in the past, and from that make some kind of reasonable prediction about the future. Should my button be on the left or the right? Will I sell more glasses of lemonade if I put fresh right up there? And that's incredibly powerful, and from that we'd be able to drive tremendous insights about any number of things. However, as the environments in which we exist become more and more complex, our ability to predict a complex future starts to break down. To quote my favorite philosopher, Mike Tyson, everyone has a strategy until they get punched in the face. And this, with the social web, is what kind of happened to media, to news, in that suddenly we had this tremendous amount of complexity coming into our world. And the worst thing about this as well was the people who are dealing with these predictions, with these decisions about what to actually do, they were us. And we kind of suck, to be honest. There's two kings of the decision-making sciences, two guys called Albert and Reifer, who work up at Harvard, and they've done a series of studies on this, where they ask groups of people to put a ranged answer to a particular question. So Catherine the Great had between 5 and 50 lovers, or the number of Tau graduates who are going to be journalists 10 years from now will be between 70 and 100%. And they could make the ranges as wide as they liked, as long as they felt they had a 98% chance of accuracy. And so they expected, when they ran this, to get a 2% error rate. Instead, the error rate was between 15 and 30%. So even when we can give the greatest range of our expectations, we're still wrong up to a third of the time. And what's interesting about this is that when they did this again with Harvard MBAs, the error rate went up to 45%, which is why I'm very glad to be in Columbia today and not Harvard. But this actually tells us something interesting, which is the more we think we know, the more expert we believe ourselves to be, the more likely we are to misjudge something or get it just plain wrong. And we work in media, where a lot of people consider themselves to be experts and have very strong opinions about what's right and what's wrong. And media, and so what analytics allowed us to do in some ways was to be able to say, not just are you right or are you wrong, but how do you adapt? Because in a complex environment, it's not about being able to make faster predictions. It's about being able to adapt to that complex environment. It's not about building more of a black box. It's about building the cockpit, as it were. So what we did with real-time analytics was, when it came into the newsroom, it was to allow a newsroom to adapt to a complex environment where they didn't know necessarily what was going to capture the imagination of their audience, what was communicated well, what was not. It was almost like an extra level of editorial. And a few things had to happen then. You couldn't just have the data purely in the analytics team and then deliver reports. That was too slow, and it was disconnected. Instead, you had to put the data directly in the hands of those people who could actually make change, actually take action. Because if you can't take action on the data, then it's kind of pointless, really. There's no one gives a damn. And so you had to put it in the hands of the people who could actually take action. That meant that you had to democratize decision-making often in newsrooms. It was no longer just the managing editor who had to make all the decisions about what was right and what was going to go where. It was being able to give people on the front lines the ability to make choices based upon the data, and then to kind of communicate that data in a way they could actually understand, because a lot of journalists are not trained data scientists. They're not, they don't look at an Excel spreadsheet like it's poetry. They're people like myself with liberal arts degrees. And so you saw that large-scale change coming in with analytics hitting the newsroom. And it was putting data directly in the hands of frontline people. The second kind of change that we saw more recently, I would argue, is that we moved from thinking about traffic to caring about audience. And that is in large part a function in some ways of the challenges that we've had making money in this business. In the early days, we just said, okay, you know what? It's impressions, it's page views, that's all we need. We just need to get as many of those things in as possible. But over the last couple of years, as we've had to learn to monetize in a variety of ways, whether it's through subscriptions and paywalls, whether it's through native advertising, whether it's through events, as some people are doing, whatever it requires people who are not just traffic, who are not just clicks on your site, but people who know who you are, like what you do, and come back. And that means understanding the people that you're working with and actually changing the nature of your behaviors. So suddenly, not just did I get someone to click, but what happened after the click, the behaviors, whether they went to another page, how much time they spent on that page, all of these as kind of leading indicators of propensity to return became important. And so one of the big changes that we saw was this move from just like total number of people to, can I make these people come back? That was a tremendous change, and we're seeing that in a variety of ways over time. And then there's a kind of third change, which I think of as hopeful. Others have said is neurotic on this panel. And that is a focus on new and better ways to measure. Because it's not just choosing any old metric, because if you choose any old metric, you'll often get very, very different results. It's choosing a metric that most aligns with your mission and your goals. And what you've seen over the last year has been an increasing focus on not just clicks, but on the total amount of attention that a piece of content can acquire. And that actually tells you very different stories often about what's important and what works and what's successful. And it also, and I don't want to talk too much the business side of things, because it's much more fun to talk about newsrooms, but it also does hold out a promise for media. Because attention is scarce. Clicks are not. And with scarce, there becomes a chance to charge premiums for quality. And if we have a web where quality content can make money, that's a web I want to be part of. So those are kind of the three kind of trends that I think we're going to be exploring a little bit today, and I want to kind of kick off with. But yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I want to dig deeper into a lot of those. Daniel, I'm going to come over to you now. So you at Upworthy have pioneered the rollout of this new metric, right, called attention minutes, which tracks signals like whether a video is actually playing, whether somebody's moving their mouse, as kind of proxies for whether someone's paying attention to a piece of content. And more generally, Upworthy is known as a very data-driven company where data is really influencing the way that you package and promote the content that you sort of surface on the web. Could you tell us a little bit about sort of the big picture thinking behind attention minutes, and then also just sort of Upworthy's broader orientation towards data?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I'm actually going to take those in the opposite order.
Okay,
So,
any order you want.
I think, when we at Upworthy think about data, we try to be realistic about data. Data is great for some things and not very useful for other things. And data for data's sake is useless. It's sexy. Big data is even sexier, but it's useless. Data is only useful insofar as it helps you make better decisions. And so, if your GPS tells you that there's traffic for the next 10 miles, but you're stuck on the highway and there's no other way to get where you're going, that's depressing data, but it's not useful data, right? If, on the other hand, you're at a fork in the road and one side has traffic and the other doesn't, knowing which one has traffic, that's useful data because you're at a decision-making point. And so when we're thinking about what data we want to use and how we want to deploy data and how we want people to be thinking about the data that we're collecting internally, we're thinking about what are the decisions that our staff are having to make all the time. And that's not just in our newsroom. We don't have a newsroom. We're a distributed office, and B, we're not journalists, so we definitely don't have a newsroom. This is the closest I've ever been to being a journalist, having this pad right here. You can tell James is a real journalist because he brought his own pad. We had to be given ones by the Tau Center. We're thinking about how is our editorial staff, our curators, what decisions are they making, and how can data help inform those decisions? We're thinking about our audience development staff, and as they're trying to distribute our content and get it out to the world, what decisions are they making, and how can they use data better? About our product staff, as they're trying to improve our website and our other products, how can they use the data? Our business team as well. So, we're interested in data that helps us make better decisions. And then once we make decisions with the data, we're interested in evaluating whether those decisions actually were made better by having the data. That's sort of our philosophy on using the data. And the data that doesn't help us make better decisions is not useful data. It just clouds judgment, because humans are really, really good at recognizing patterns. We're so good at recognizing patterns in data that sometimes we invent patterns in data that aren't really there. And so it's very tempting when shown a bunch of data to think, oh, there's a pattern there, even when we can rigorously analyze and say, no, actually, there isn't any meaning to be had from this data. This data can't help us make better decisions. And we get in big fights with members of our staff because they really want that data because they're used to that data, and don't take my data away. But we've looked, and it doesn't add any value to the decisions that they're making. It doesn't help them make better decisions, and so we hide that data because it's just distracting. So that's the answer to your second question. The answer to your first question about attention, I can't quote Mike Tyson, sadly, but I will quote Dan Ariely, the behavioral psychologist, who said, "You are what you measure." And this just follows on something that Tony said. Picking the right metrics, picking the metrics that align with what your actual goals are, is critical. If you're not doing that, you're done. And not in a good way. So, we asked ourselves, what is it that we're actually trying to achieve? And the thing we're trying to achieve is we want to draw massive amounts of attention to the things that really matter. We don't want to draw massive amounts of clicks to the things that really matter. We don't want to draw massive numbers of visitors to the things that really matter. We want to draw massive amounts of attention. And therefore, the closer we can get to measuring actual attention, the better we're going to be able to figure out if we're achieving our goal or not. If we were trying to draw massive numbers of visitors, then uniques would be a great measure. But that's not what we're trying to do. If we have, hundreds of millions of people, but they have very, very light touches on this stuff, that's not achieving our goal of drawing massive amounts of attention. So that's why we measure attention, is because that's what we actually care about. Because you are what you measure, if you choose the wrong metric, every metric can be juked, right? People can find ways to play with it. The classic example is page views. If you're measuring page views, all of a sudden things become, slideshows, because that's 10 page views where there would have been one, right? And so we actually have, there's one of our curators who's very, very good about numbers and strategy and juking numbers, basically. And so when we think about a new metric, we'll either put ourselves in his shoes or go and ask him, how would you juke this metric? And attention, it turns out, is a lot harder to juke than the other metrics. And so that's why we like it, because it's hard to juke, because it actually measures, if you're really measuring what you're trying to achieve, then if someone jukes that stat, you're achieving what you wanted, right? If he jukes it in a way that, oh God, we're getting lots more attention than we were before, we're achieving our goal. So that's why we're interested in attention. And we're very glad to be in good company with Chartbeat and Medium, and to some extent YouTube as well, who are starting to think about the world in terms of attention too. As Tony said, you know, attention is a scarce commodity. You only have 24 hours in a day, whereas clicks, you can just keep clicking. So, you know, as we're fighting for a bigger piece of that pie, the pieces of the pie that go to, you know, celebrity slideshows and you know, primetime television, which frankly is still the biggest piece of the pie by far, right? We're thinking the only way that the zero-sum game is for attention. And so the more that we can win that and pull people's attention to things that really matter, climate change and body image and the way that media portrays women and you know, bullying and things like that, like we're happy with the attention we can draw. Whereas the page views we can draw to that, whoop-de-doo.
Okay, thank you so much. Now I'm going to turn it over to James. So James, you were the first analytics person to kind of be in the New York Times newsroom full-time, if I'm correct about that. So if you could just sort of say a little bit about what that experience has been like and what's been interesting about it, and then also kind of a similar question as I posed to Daniel, you know, what is the Times' kind of philosophy vis-a-vis data, and how does that sort of translate into both your role and also, you know, your communication with folks in the newsroom?
Right. Well, I'll give you my philosophies. I don't know if the Times has a philosophy about data yet. First of all, thanks for the pads. My kids are still at an age where, like, this is the best present I could bring them. It's like a blank pad and a pen. It's awesome. Anyway,
Kids
so
are so
yes,
creative.
they're great. Yeah, they're fantastic. Anyway, so I've been at the Times for 8 years. I don't have a background in statistics or numbers. I'm not a data scientist. I spent 5 years, however, as director of web analytics at the time, focusing mainly on the business side. And then about a year ago, I was invited to come down to the newsroom and see if we could figure out how to take audience insights and apply them to newsroom decision-making at the Times, which is a relatively new initiative. I think 5 years ago, this would never have happened, and the fact that it's happening, or happened a year ago, is really actually kind of interesting and inspiring. There's a lot of talk about metrics here, and I just want to clarify. My job is not to bring metrics or data into the newsroom of the Times. My job is to bring insights about our audience into the Times so that we can better understand and think about our audience. And I think that's a really important distinction to draw, and something that's often conflated is the difference between, in the practice of analytics, the difference between reporting and insight generation and analytics. And they're two very, very, very different things that often get confused. Reporting is often about like evaluation. It's about counting large numbers of things and seeing whether you're doing a good job or not. That's not what the Times wants out of our news analytics team. Instead, what we want to do is understand our audience better so that we can better serve them and we can align newsroom decision-making towards them. And that really is more of like a qualitative, let's figure out what people are doing so we can serve them better. I think the problem arises when we try to like get at insights by asking for reporting, and that's generally what happens a lot. Because people don't really know how to phrase the questions when they talk to an analyst in a way that generates insights. They ask for numbers. One of the biggest questions that I get is, how did my story do, right? Have you asked that question, right? And really to answer that question, the only thing we can do is turn to tools that were built for other purposes that are designed to deliver large numbers, aggregate metrics of things. And that's not really insightful for a journalist at the Times. In fact, they often don't know how to interpret that. And because of the way our numbers line up, they search for things to compare that number to, whether it's other journalists. Our numbers line up so that it's almost like a salary scale. So you can say like, oh, your story got 20,000 visits. And they're like, oh, 20,000, I couldn't live on 20,000 a year. But then you say like 150,000, they're like, oh, that's pretty comfortable, that's good, right? Or if you say 1 million visits, and it's like, oh, I'm a millionaire, right? And that's how we evaluate our own success, is sort of like in these large numbers from tools that were designed for marketers. And it's not, at the end of the day, really useful in what we're trying to do as we embark on our digital transformation. The follow-up question to that question is always, is that good? And that's like kind of a more interesting question. And that's something that my team tries to explore on a daily basis. Engagement is something that people strive to measure endlessly, neurotically, perhaps. I don't know if engagement can be boiled down to a single metric, and in terms of what my role is, I don't really care. I really want to understand what engagement is. To me, engagement is a state of mind. It's something that occurs in somebody's head. It's an attitude. It's like love in that respect. Apologies if those of you heard me say this before, but it's like trying to measure how much I love my wife by how many flowers I buy her every week, right? It really doesn't achieve anything.
Wait, that's not a good measure of...
It's one of the measures. 5, I buy her 5. But engagement is really the alignment between what we want people to do and what they want to do at the end of the day. And if those two things are aligned, then people are going to be engaged with our site. So to do that, we have to be able to clearly enunciate what we want people to do and what our users want to do. And both of those things are much different than just pulling numbers out of our spreadsheet. This is not to say that numbers and metrics don't have a role in what we do, but they're a means to an end. And they're often the tools of analysts to deliver insights back to our newsroom. Now, how do you get past this sort of like fixation on numbers? I find that there are two types of questions that we come across on a daily basis. There are explicit questions and implicit questions. And the explicit questions are often around numbers. How did I do is an explicit question. Give me a number. Tell me how many people come from the UK, right? And those things are people asking for numbers because we really want insights. And often what we do is we deliver these dashboards to people full of numbers when what they're really asking for is a model of how the world works. Right? Dashboards are really useful when you have a fully fleshed model, you know how your system is supposed to run, you know the inputs and the outputs, and you want to make sure that you're on track. A dashboard is really useful when you're going 60 miles an hour down the highway. But if your car is stopped on the side of the road, and that's not what I'm saying is the case at the Times, if your car is stopped at the side of the road, right, a dashboard is not going to do you much good. You want to open up the engine and understand what's going on there. And really the way to get to those questions are implicit questions. They're questions that people are always asking, but they're not really asking. They're like assumptions, hypotheses, habits, and to get at those questions, you really have to listen. You really have to embed yourself, as we do in our newsroom, our daily processes, the meetings that we have, the decisions that people are actually making on a day-to-day basis, and listen for those moments where people say, well, my mother does this. Well, that's a question, right? This is how my mother uses the site. That's a question. That's like, well, I don't really know how people use the site, so I'm just going to grasp onto the only piece of evidence I have. Or this is the way we've always done it. That's a good one, right? Okay, why do you refresh the homepage every 2 hours? Because that's what we decided 2 years ago. Well, why did we decide that 2 years ago? What was the thinking, right? And it becomes a conversational process. It becomes a really iterative process of embedding yourself in a culture, understanding that culture, understanding how people make decisions in that, what they value, which is important, not taking a condescending or patronizing attitude towards those attitudes, because that is really where the value of the Times is drawn from at the end of the day. And then working with them to unpack those questions and find out how we can contribute what we know about our audience towards them. So I think a really important value to have when you are in a situation that we are, which is in some ways unique, is what I would call reciprocal humility. So humility part of the data analyst, to know that the work that the journalists do are valuable, the skills they have are valuable, the jobs that they do are valuable, and you're trying to help them. And that helps you get past sort of the instinct of a data scientist to delve into the numbers first, come back and present sort of like a David Copperfield magic trick where I've gone into the data and I found all these wonderful things about our audience and their segments A through E, and then the editor at the end of the day goes home and is like, well, that was interesting, and never uses it. It's a point of frustration. But I think there has to be humility on the sides of the people that we work with as well, not to ask for numbers for the sake of numbers and understand that the analyst is trying to deliver insights in the ways that they know how. And to do that, it takes sort of like sort of a different attitude than saying, well, I'm trying to find the truth through dashboards. I'm trying to find the truth through numbers. Let me explain to you what I'm trying to do and how I do it, and find out how you can help me without exactly knowing where that's going to lead. So that's just a brief synopsis of what we're doing at the Times. Interested to hear your questions and continue the conversation. So.
Thanks to all three of you for kind of laying down some groundwork that we can work from. So the kind of question that I want to open with or start thinking about, that I've been thinking about a lot, is sort of this question about commensuration, right? So one thing that numbers do, whether the number is attention minutes, whether it's engaged time, whether it's page views or uniques, is that they compare things. They sort of rank things. And so often when you see, for instance, Chartbeat's big board, that's a ranking of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And this is kind of coming back to a subject that I think all three of you touched on, but how do you know that you're comparing the right things? How do you know that you're comparing like with like, in other words? So obviously, you know, I've spoken to many reporters, and one of them said, you know, if one of my stories gets 425,000 hits and another one gets 375,000, how do I, you know, it's similar to what you said, is that, how do I interpret that? How do I know, you know, they're about completely different subjects. How can I sort of take these two things that seem like apples and oranges and apply the same standard, no matter what that standard is, to all of them? So I would be curious to hear kind of how each of you thinks about that question of commensuration, and making sure that you have an apples to apples comparison going on when you use this kind of data.
I think the first thing I'd say is that the data is just data. It's just one part of a huge amount of decision making that involves editorial gut and everything else. I think there's a couple of things that we think about. So for example, when we look at a homepage, we're not just interested in the number 1 story, the number 2 story, the number 3 story. I'm interested in considering the amount of demand on the page. What would a story in that position normally do? Would it normally get 1,000 people coming through? Would it normally get 500 people going through? What's the kind of opportunity cost of having put something else there? And one of the kind of key things for me though around this is it's not necessarily about ranking stories so much as it like, I had a particular thing that I wanted to communicate to my audience. How well am I doing at communicating that? Because if I've written the most amazing story in the world, but no one's getting to it and no one's reading it, or they're bailing on paragraph 2, I've not completed my job as a journalist. My job is not to write, it is to communicate. And so being able to understand that, I don't think that necessarily it's a question of like, what's the number 3 story, not what's the number 5 story. It's a question of considering the story that I wrote and what I hope the response to be. How do I make sure that I can adapt whatever I did to make sure that I get that response? Whether it's like people aren't staying long enough on that story, or people aren't getting through to that story in the first place, whether it's a headline issue, whether it's the fact that you buried the lead. You can get all that from data, and that's actually much, much more interesting and more useful than that. Where big boards and things like that come in handy, is not about ranking the stories, it's to kind of ask yourself, is what we thought was important the same as what our audience thinks is important? Where can they surprise us? And I remember my kind of favorite version of story of this was actually with the Boston Globe. Do you guys remember when they realized that all the zodiac signs were wrong? They were all off by like a month. So it turns out I'm no longer a Taurus, I'm no longer stubborn or anything like that. I'm something brand new, which is great. And the Boston Globe thought this was a huge, important story they should put front kind of H1, big image on the front, and no one cared. You know, they were quite happy with the star sign they'd always had, and they didn't really want to read about this. And what was blowing up was this story about a local theater which had burnt down, which actually had real resonance with the community. That's what people cared about. And to be able to see quite simply, wow, we completely misjudged our audience. They're actually often smarter than we give them credit for, or they're interested in different things. That's where these kind of things are useful. Not necessarily like this is number 1 and this is number 3.
Yeah, I mean, to your core question of how do you make sure that you're comparing like to like, the answer is you usually can't. You can do your best, and you know the best way that we as humans know how to do that, because we don't have parallel universes, but the best way the closest we can get, I don't have, Tony has parallel universes.
CEO power.
The closest we can get is randomized controlled trials, right?
Right.
Those are rare in the real world. They're hard to set up. They're not impossible to set up. The web is kind of a crazy place, and so sometimes we can get pretty close to that. But most of the time we can't, right? How do we know that something published in December is comparable to something published in January? We don't. How do we know that something is, you know, on this page is comparable to something, you know, pushed on this page? We don't. We can make adjustments to try to account for those differences, for all of the other confounds that are a part of that comparison, and we do try to do that. You know, we make models. All models are wrong. Some are useful, right? So we make models that are as useful as we can, but we don't know that we're comparing like to like. As Tony said, though, you know, I think one of the questions we're constantly asking ourselves is how does this how does this compare to our expectations of how it's doing? And that's useful because it can help sort of elucidate, but it's not the same as having perfectly comparable things. So, yeah, I would just say the short answer is no, we don't know that things are comparable. People love to obsess about 425,000 versus 375,000. That's, not very useful. We went through a very long process of hiding numbers from our curators, where we replaced them with words that we haggled over the terminology for several months, and ended up with things like bestish, because we didn't want to communicate more certainty than we as analysts really had. So bestish kind of communicated that. Probably worse, maybe worse, definitely worse, right? So those are literally the words that our curators see. Then our product folks realized that some visual cues would help with that, so they added color, and then they asked me for pictures of me going like this and me going like this, which I didn't know what they were going to do with, and now on the page it has me making thumbs down or thumbs up signs, which is problematic because when I meet new curators, they're like, "You're real!" But yeah, I mean, so because numbers are sort of misleading, right? Because you want to make that comparison between 425,000 and 375,000, and because a lot of the time we're sampling, and so there's sampling error on top of that you have to deal with, and humans are really bad. Regular people don't like incorporating p-values into their work. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's just like a measure of how confident you are, basically, or a margin of error, and people suck at that, right? So rather than p-values, bestish was one of the ways that we tackled the problem.
I know you gave us pads now because I just wrote down commensuration because I'd never heard that before. I feel like I'm on the spelling bee. It's great.
That's
okay.
the next phase.
Great. I'm not an academic. So that question is really, really important to us. When I talked about that question, like how did my story do, I didn't mean to dismiss it as if it wasn't important. In fact, it's critically important. But pulling numbers out and trying to compare them to other stories is not, I think, the best way to do it. What we'd like to be able to do is to compare the total amount of traffic or visitors to a story to what we would expect it to be. And there's a couple of ways of doing that, but the one that we'd like to get at is trying to understand from all that we know about our audience, what if we could model out the people who would be interested in a particular story based on what we already know, and use that as the denominator on that number. So let's say there's, out of the millions of people that we have in our database, we can say there's 50,000 interested in the topic of Syria. How many of those 50,000 people, I'm inventing these numbers, how many of those 50,000 people actually came and read or watched a video about Syria? And if they did, why did they? And if they didn't, why didn't they? And I think once you get into that, again, which is sort of an evaluative metric, you get into all these really interesting opportunities when it comes to understanding your audiences. Because the Times doesn't necessarily think of audiences. To the degree they think about audience at all, they think of the audience of the New York Times, the readership of the New York Times, which is perfectly valid in a print world, but in a digital world is not quite as valid. And one of the things that we did when we started News Analytics is whenever there was a big story planned, we would actually talk to the editors to get their take on who they thought the audience for a particular story was. I remember we did this story called The Jockey, which was a really great in-depth look at a jockey who had won 50,000 races in California. It was a big package that we put out. And I went to the editors involved in the project, and I said, who's the target audience for this piece? And they said, well, it's the readership of the New York Times. And I said, okay, so let's just try, that's cool, but let's try to narrow that down a little bit and understand what audience characteristics do you think would make somebody more predisposed to be interested in this article than another? And so they thought about that a little bit, which was really interesting watching them do that. And they said some of the hypotheses were people who read the sports section, okay? Subscribers, that's interesting. People who read Snowfall, because this was a very elaborate presentation, and that was interesting too. And I said, well, what about horse racing fans? And they said, well, this story transcends horse racing. Yeah? Well, maybe it does, and in fact, it might have well done that, right? But if you can't get horse racing fans to read this article and love it and share it and be ecstatic over it, then that's probably a leading indicator of failure. And one of the things that we know or can estimate with some degree of precision is the people on our site who are more interested in horse racing. We can actually thanks to the taxonomy of our site, we can actually look at all the stories that have been written about horse racing and look at the number of people or the actual people who have read 2 or more stories about horse racing. We'd say, maybe that's our success metric for this piece, is how many of those people have come back and read it and loved it and share it, which may be a very small number, but it may be more interesting. Again, evaluative. What's interesting is when we pull out those horse racing fans, we can actually compare them to a random cohort of people on our site with similar behaviors. And we can say, what characterizes horse racing fans? What do they do? Who are they? What age group do they fall into? Can we paint sort of an impressionistic picture of that audience, that if we decide to write a story about horse racing, again, we can actually empower journalists with the knowledge that there are this many people who are interested in your work, and these are the characteristics that they observe, that they exhibit. And even more so, when we publish the jockey piece and we say that there's a certain percentage of the people reading it are horse racing fans and a certain percentage aren't, we can look at the people who are reading the jockey piece who aren't horse racing fans and see what characterizes them, right? So we can understand that audience as well. So you've taken a hypothesis from the editor, you've sort of measured to what extent we're reaching those people, and maybe we can deliver back another audience that they may not have been knowledgeable about. And in fact, when we did that for the jockey piece, we found that there was the audience who read jockey who were not horse racing fans over-indexed for being in the media industry, right? Which makes sense, right? Because this in some ways was published to the echo chamber to flex our muscles, to show off the sorts of things that we can do. And maybe that's one of the outcomes that we're looking for in that piece. Not only reaching an audience of people who are interested in the story, showing off what we can do, and maybe it's the next time we have an opening on the graphics desk, we get a better qualified candidate as a result because they've seen the type of work that we've done. Maybe that's a perfectly valid outcome for the newsroom. And so that process is something that's really, really important for us, and we're going on it, is understanding for every story on our site, depending on the topic, what else we know about it, can we model out the group of readers who are interested in it, and maybe over time we can develop sub-audiences loyal to a particular beat, which would be really valuable to the business side as well. Scale is important to us. It's not the only thing that's important to us. In the subscription business, every incremental subscriber is really, really valuable, and so you can operate at a much smaller scale when you start thinking about things like loyalty. So that's the direction that we're headed in that respect.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, so one thing that sort of came up was this question of moving from numbers to insight, or who's going to be interpreting data. So Daniel, you said that you guys have sort of kept some data from your curators, and instead of numbers, they get you with a thumbs up, and you, in that case, you're sort of in the role of the interpreter. Similarly, at the Times, reporters don't necessarily regularly have access to all analytics tools that maybe editors are using or that you're using. But then Tony, when you spoke, you said, we want to get these tools into the hands of the doers, right? So is there a tension there at all? Is there, who should and who does sort of have the role of interpreting this data, and should it not be reporters? Should it not be curators? Should it instead be people who kind of know what a p-value is? Not that reporters don't all know what a p-value is, but maybe some of them don't. Or should it be sort of the people making the quick news placement editorial decisions?
So the answer is yes. Quite frankly, I think of it in kind of two very different ways. In that there's and James put it really well. There's the kind of how did I do questions, and there's kind of deeper questions behind that. The kind of true insights that you get from being able to kind of delve into the data, try and ask the right questions, and generate insight about an audience. And that stuff is incredibly valuable, and it will help you build a better audience, and will do that. There's also the question that you get equally often, which is, what should I do right now? Mm-hmm. And that's a question where we have to deal with issues of scalability, where you're not going to have people going into huge amounts of depth on every single story, looking for those insights. It's like, how do I do the right possible thing by this story right now when I'm publishing hundreds of stories potentially a day? And in those situations, being able to democratize data and decision making, being able to put it in the hands of people in the right way, but this is absolutely key. It's not just a question, as both James and Daniel pointed. If you just give numbers to people, that's no good. It's kind of like the way I think about it is very much like the nascence of the personal computer. Like if when the personal computer had come out, you just given a flashing command line to everyone and said, "There, have at it," very few people would have known what the hell to do. Instead, there was a realization that with a new audience, there needed to be new ways of communicating that data. It didn't have to be numbers. It had to be something, whether it's like Daniel's face, or it's an entire operating system like the original Mac OS. Whatever these things are, you can find different ways of communicating the core thing that they need to know, which is often like, where should I act? Where should I focus my activities? What are the things that I'm trying to do? So for example, the two kind of balanced metrics that we think about when we're looking at propensity to return, which is kind of important if you want to grow audience, is balancing kind of recirculation. So the propensity of someone once they've read a story to go on to an additional story, and the amount of time that you spend on a story. And so being able to understand, how am I doing at a basic level on these two metrics, these two balanced metrics on any particular story, gives someone an understanding of, once I've got people there, once I've got the headline did its job, the image did its job, and people got here, were they performing the kind of behaviors? Do I need to change something? Or is this story actually just a bad story? In some ways, it's not successfully communicating. So it's trying to balance the kind of high level, I think of it almost like the Newtonian clockwork universe of insight, where we have the time and so forth, and there's the kind of messy quantum, what needs to happen right now universe as well. So yeah, the overarching answer is yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, to the point about hiding data, that goes to what I was saying earlier, just about data is useful only insofar as it helps us make better decisions. So we strive really hard to understand what are the decisions people are making every day. How can we put the right data in front of them? How can we give them the right tools to put that data in context and make sense of it, rather than just, here are some numbers, do with it what you will, because that doesn't turn out well. And I think I like how James put it about implicit and explicit questions. We work really hard to get people to ask us the business question that they're grappling with, and by business question I don't mean just our revenue side, but business question in the sort of curatorial broadest sense, because my team of analysts is better at translating business questions into analytic questions than the rest of our team. That's what we specialize in, right? So if you ask me, give me the number of people who came to our site last month from the UK, that's not a business question, that's an analytic question. I can give you a number, but it's more useful to me to say, why do you want it, what are you trying to figure out with that? And if they come back and say, oh, well, we're trying to see how that number compares to other English-speaking countries and whether or not we can grow the share of our, okay, now we have a business question. Now we can think about what is the broader context that we need to put on this question, what are all of the numbers that we need to pull. That's what my team specializes in, right, is figuring out how to translate those business questions into analytic questions. And so if you've already done the translation, you may have done it well, but you may have done it poorly, and we'll never know if you don't tell us what the underlying thing you're trying to figure out is, what the implicit question you're trying to figure out is.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't set policy in terms of these things, but my personal policy with regards to work that we do is you've got to come visit me and have a chat before we set you up on any of the tools that we have, and that's as much for my own elucidation as is for me being worried that people will misinterpret what we do. Because what we've been doing for the first year of existence is rapidly building highly functional prototypes. And so the tools that we build are really, really fluid, and they change dynamically based on the things that we hear and see. So when I give somebody a tool, it's not like a finished, full-baked tool that they can go use. It's a starting point for a conversation, an ongoing conversation, which will often iterate and tack based on the ways in which we see people making decisions. And if there's not that communication there and that partnership there, then I don't know how we deliver the value at the end of the day.
Great, thank you. I think we should start taking some questions from the audience. So go ahead.
Cruise unique visits and are familiar terms, but I'm not as familiar with how attention units or A4 engagement is measured. So what are some of the unique metrics used to measure them, such as moving a mouse while playing a video?
So moving the mouse while it's not a metric in and of itself. I think the key thing that, and you'll find that with both engaged time and actual attention minutes, is remarkably similar methodologies. What we have found across multiple lab studies is that what we want to understand is, are you paying attention to the page or not? Not is the page open as one of many, many tabs where you've kind of gone off. Are you actually paying attention to the content in front of you? And what we found is that when you're paying attention to content, so the mean is about every 1.1 seconds, but for 95% of people, 95% of the time, you've made some kind of human-computer interaction within 4.8 seconds. So That means you've either moved the mouse in some way, you've scrolled, you've tapped a key, you've done something to suggest that you're alive and that you have a pulse in the last 5 seconds. So what metrics like this do is they ask a series of questions every second. So every second we say, 1, is this the active window in the browser? 2, what are the pixels in view right now? And 3, in the last 5 seconds, have we heard from you in some way to suggest that you're there? If so, classify this 1 second as active, as attention, as engaged, whatever you want to call it. And from that, you can get a remarkably accurate picture of people's actual behavior. So you can tell that someone started to read the first 3 paragraphs, then got distracted by someone or something for 20 seconds, and then came back, read a bit more, and then bailed halfway through. Like, that's the kind of data that you can get when you start looking at attention. Does that make sense?
And the one other thing that we use, which I think you may use as well, is we'll plug in, because a lot of our content is video or audio, we'll plug into the API of YouTube or Vimeo player to try to see whether or not the thing is still playing, right? So we're polling that player and saying, hey, is the user still watching the video? Because people will sit back and watch a video, and so they won't be moving their mouse, but their video is still playing, and so that's also a good active signal that the person is paying attention. And then what we do, and what Chartbeat does as well, is we'll roll those up, so you're sort of constantly checking, are you there, are you there, are you there, are you there? And then every so often, you'll send a signal, an event, to our servers that say, this person was just there for 10 more seconds. And so that's the thing that we're measuring. We measure attention minutes. Right, so we can measure on a per user basis, on average, how many minutes is a user spending on this page, how many people are spending 0 seconds, which is just less than 10 for us, because we send every 10 seconds, how many people are spending a minute, how many people are spending 2, 3, 4 minutes. And then also we can see total attention minutes across a piece of content. So all users, how much time did they spend on that?
And that's actually really important. And so total attention minutes or total engaged time, these are numbers that are very useful, because it's not just a number, it's not just measuring one thing, it's measuring the number of people and the amount of time combined into one metric effectively. Like, you can have 10,000 people spend 20 seconds on a story, or you can have 2,000 people spend 2 minutes on a story. Each one of these can give you the total amount of attention that this article accrues, and actually the 2,000 people will actually beat the 10,000 people in this occasion. So what this does in a quite nice fashion is it enables you to balance the kind of quick hit stories that are very attractive to people but don't hold them, with some of the kind of longer, more thoughtful stories which may attract fewer people but holds them for longer.
Just one word of caution about this. These guys are very sophisticated, and a lot of legacy tools don't track time spent properly. So just be careful when you're dealing with older systems.
So Google Analytics is not measuring attention minutes or engaged time.
Yeah.
Those are 2 totally different metrics. If you want to know after the panel, we can explain exactly how Google Analytics measures time on page and time on site. It is super janky, especially for media sites. It's better for e-commerce sites because they're probably getting more signals. But we noticed at one point that our average time on page was about 20 minutes, according to Google Analytics. We're really good. We're not that good. We knew we weren't that good, and that was part of what led us to say, we need a more serious way to measure how much time people are actually paying attention. And so that was part of what led us to build out attention minutes. Sorry? Oh, sorry, an API is an application programming interface. It's just a way for our system to talk to YouTube or talk to Vimeo and say, hey, is the video still playing? Is the video still playing? Is the video still playing?
If you have questions, please, if you could line up behind the microphone there so folks can hear you. And Nick, I will start with you.
Hi, yeah, so I'm interested in what kind of stories we might be interested in editorially that might not be reflected in the data that we're able to capture or that we're able to measure. So for instance, in some of my research, I've been looking at what kinds of news headlines get shared on social media, and it turns out that certain types of news, like court reporting, is not as frequently shared. So that's something that is sort of reflected in the data, and we can measure that there's different attentional patterns. But maybe there's other things that we think are important that we can't measure, or that are not as clearly reflected in things like the social signal that we're getting. And what can we do about that?
Well, the good news is, in some ways, for your court reporting, is there's absolutely no correlation whatsoever between social shares and the average amount of engaged time that your stories will get. There's just no relation whatsoever. The important thing for me to say is, like, we're, as James said, we're like fairly sophisticated at building analytics now. We're not anywhere close to being able to understand importance, or true impact. In terms of change and so forth, and I think that's going to be a very, very hard thing. So this is, when I say that this is just data, in some ways this is just one perspective, it's just one signal, and I always think of it as just like another layer beyond the kind of the data that you get back from a good editor who gives you feedback on what's working and what's not. This is just one other voice to pay attention to, but it's not the voice.
Yeah, I mean, so I come out of the activism world, and measuring impact is really hard, right? The world is messy, and so figuring out what you did and what other people did is sort of what we call attribution in this world is very hard, or in the e-commerce world is very hard. And so, a story that 200 people saw about some corrupt public official, but that got that public official to resign, had a huge impact, wasn't seen by that many people, maybe didn't, register that many shares or any of that stuff, but it had a clear impact, right? That would not have happened but for that story. That's a really important, impactful story. How do we capture that? I don't know, it's hard. Some of the impact we can capture pretty easily, like when we post a video of a Kickstarter project, and the Kickstarter creator then reports back to us, hey, people with your link raised $100,000 for us, we can measure that, pretty easily. But real world impact can be really hard to pick up on. We get a lot of anecdata about that. We'll get, I watched this and it really changed the way I think about this, but that's hard to sort of quantify in a bigger sense. So yeah, I mean, I think impact is hard. I mean, to Tony's point about importance, one of the things I often hear from my colleagues is, oh, we can't measure that. And my response is often, we can measure it. We might not be able to measure it in a quantitative way, but we might be able to measure it in a qualitative way. So one of the things we think about a suite of things, sort of 3 dimensions. One is importance, one is user satisfaction, and one is quality. And so when we think about the importance of a particular piece that we publish, we don't have a quantitative way to measure that. But I have a good qualitative way to measure that, which is that we have editors who look at it and go, hey, this is a really important piece. We should write down somewhere in our database that this is a really important piece. And that lets us say the really important pieces that we published got this much attention, and the just generally important but not really important stuff got this much attention. So we're working on it. Qualitative measures are really important and give a much fuller picture than just quantitative measures, but it's hard.
Yeah, I agree with the qualitative piece. We know a lot about what happens in people's fingers. We know nothing about what happens in their head. It's a totally different discipline. It's something we should have downstairs in the newsroom. There's a way to, to do that as well. So I'd agree with that.
Thanks, guys.
Great.
Hello, I would like to know to what extent the advertisers are considering attention and engagement and not only traffic. And also maybe to James, if you can explain us a little bit more about the case of the jockey and the use of data. So in that case, did you do, for instance, anything special to get the attention of the fans of racehorses in any way or to any other group? Thank you.
I'll answer that quickly first.
go for it.
Yeah, so that's something that we're working towards. I mean, audience development is really important to the Times at the moment, and coming up with ways and strategies to do that in a way that's natural and respects what we value and what we care about is a huge priority. So, so it's an ongoing effort, I would say, in that respect, to think about in that way when we publish a story who the audiences are and how to reach them.
So I can speak to the advertiser side of things because that's the.
You should have come to the panel we did last week.
Yeah.
Advertisers at attention.
That was fun. We had more whiskey at that panel. So increasingly is the answer. There's a few things. One, brands, advertisers are becoming increasingly frustrated with click-through rate as a measure for brand advertising. They want to be able to communicate their message to an audience when they have their attention. So being able to directly measure that is interesting. However, there's been a tremendous amount of inertia that is the defining force of the advertising world is inertia. And one of the things though that's interesting is that after 6 years of fighting you finally saw kind of an agreement about a viewability metric come into advertising. And viewability itself is whatever, but what's interesting about it is it started to say there is, in some ways, a quantitative difference between these two different ad placements, where the impact of the user has some impact, the actions of the user has some impact. So what you're seeing now is increasingly people putting into advertising RFPs. I don't just want viewability, I want like 10 seconds in front of this person, I want 20 seconds in front of this person. So you're starting to see this happen now. It's very early days, it may all blow up and go away, and we may be stuck with the click-through rate for the rest of our days on the web. However, I'm hopeful that advertisers can see the advantage of measuring what they actually care about, to Daniel's point about measuring something closely aligned to their goals.
Hey, I'm Sarah Glenn, new engagement associate at Chartbeat, and I have a question about how you guys would recommend tracking social shares, if you have any tools to recommend for that, or how much importance you would put on that.
That's Chalkbeat, not Chartbeat, just to be clear.
Yes.
Ask Annika, she's great. Social shares. So we have a whole suite. I mean, we have obviously all the tools at our disposal. I mean, the issue of like how something permeates the social world, we often append query strings and use that to model out how people are moving through. I think it's sometimes possible to fixate too much on those things because a lot of social, as you know, is organic. And, you know, it's harder and harder to tell from referrers how people are coming to our site. But, I mean, we have basically standard tools we use for that sort of tracking.
I'm not going to answer this question because I'm biased.
Yeah, I mean, the tools are pretty standard because they're defined by the walled gardens that are the social media companies. And so, you know, different social companies make it easier or harder to figure out what exactly is going on in their world. Sometimes they don't even know what is going on often they don't even know what is going on in their world. So, I mean, you can make educated guesses based on the sort of signals that leak out, but it's hard. The standard sort of APIs to connect to Facebook and Twitter and whatever else are fine, and they give you counts, but they don't give you a real clear picture of what's happening.
So you would recommend not really focusing too much time and energy trying to track that?
I would recommend buying one of the off-the-shelf products. I will not say which. We use not Chartbeat, so I actually am not biased. That's mostly because we have our own whole internal analytics suite. But
Daniel likes to build things.
I do like to build things, or have other people in the audience build things for me.
I will say one thing that we found, which people overlook, is there's a strong connection between social and mobile. And people often talk about them separately, and they're really, in our world, like part and parcel of the same thing. So question from different groups talking about mobile and social are often connected.
Thanks.
So James, you spoke a little bit about differentiating your audience and being able to tell, how well a story did with sports fans versus members of the media, whoever else. So I was wondering if you had any advice for building up a baseline by which you can, do that differentiation, and then along with that, what have you found are the most useful and most valuable lines to draw between people to do that differentiation, whether it's, age or profession or income or, whatever interests or whatever else?
Yep. It's really early days because there are no tools that I know of that do what we want to do. So we're building it from scratch. That's one of the ways in which the Times, I think, is very unique. We have the resources to be able to do that. We have a very rigorous taxonomy of tagging content on our site, which is very, very good. That allows us to say a story is about horse racing versus something else. We have a team of people who do that all day. So we have a lot of sort of advantages that allow us to do it, but that being said, we haven't built it yet. So we're still sort of in the prototyping experimentation phase of that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'd say that everyone is. So you have, and you're trying to understand audience from a kind of broader context. One, the DMPs, like the Blue Kais and the X-Lates of this world, have pretty poor data to use. We were talking to someone recently who claimed that they had 60 million people that they were tracking in the US that made more than 100 grand a year. There's 18 million people that make more than 100 grand a year in the US. It seemed optimistic. There are tools like, there's a tool called Crux, which tries to create audience segments from behaviors on your site. The one thing that I'd say around this is that if you're looking at this from a kind of editorial and audience development perspective, it can sometimes be wise not to just purely rely upon the audience segments that marketing uses. Because what will sometimes happen is you'll say, with marketing, say, okay, I've got a group of behaviors that I'm going to say are executives. Shit, that's not big enough. Let's relax some of these things and make this a bit bigger so that we can have a big enough group that we can try and sell as executives, whereas that's not necessarily what you want to do if you're trying to develop for an audience. So just one little caveat to be careful of in the different groups of a company.
Right. Great. Thanks.
Hi, Tony, you were saying how data is just data, and then Daniel, you were saying how sometimes people see patterns in data that aren't necessarily there. And I found this interesting just because in my line of work, we're discussing this mysterious data concept of sentiment quite a lot at the moment. And I was just wondering how you go about knowing where to draw the line between making decisions based on data and decisions based on people's experience and intuitions.
Yeah, I mean, we try to take advantage of the pattern matching algorithms or pattern matching machines that are human beings a lot. I tend to think of the data that we have in 4 big classes. So one is we have this data and we know exactly what it means. That's rare. Another is we have this data and we have a pretty good idea what it means. The third is we have this data, we don't really know what it means. And the fourth is we have this data and we know that it doesn't mean anything. And there's a surprising amount of stuff in that 4th class. And so we try very hard to get rid of that, to get that away from people, because that's the part that will inevitably lead them astray if they try to take any meaning from it at all. The 3rd class is hard, but the reality is that, like, I, as an analyst, am not in the weeds working with and seeing the data every single day in context. The people in other parts of the organization are. And so they're the ones who start to notice patterns, who start to ask questions, who start to say, hey, I've been noticing that this thing keeps happening over and over. That's enormously valuable to us, right? That hypothesis generation is enormously valuable. We can't do that. We can then take those hypotheses and see if we can validate them or invalidate them. And that's really important. Because if everyone's just going off their gut based on what they think the data means, that's the wild, wild west, and it's pretty dangerous, right? So, you know, I see our role not as doing the hypothesis generation so much, but rather as trying to validate or invalidate those hypotheses. And yeah, I mean, but these aren't easy answers. There's no like, oh yes, you just put this data to the side and then but you know, the stuff that you know doesn't mean anything, get it away from people, because they will pull a John Nash beautiful mind scenario with it and have stuff pinned about how this, no, if this happens on a Friday, it means that, yeah.
Can I just make one observation? I think we tend to equate complexity with value a lot of the time. And we say, well, the more complicated a model is, the more complicated an effort is, the more valuable it is. And in my experience, the most valuable things are the most obvious things. And analytics often, like, that's really, really valuable to know that something is just seriously wrong and it's obvious to everybody involved. And analytics sometimes helps you be able to do that. I have a statistician friend, my smartest guy statistician I know, who says, I go to him often saying, is this significant? And he said, well, if you need a statistician to tell you whether something is significant, it's probably not significant, right? And it sounds silly, but there are these obvious things, and you can't let people skip past them. Like, oh, there's this big problem, we have to fix it now. Oh, well, what if we did a machine learning? Well, hold on, just time out. We can do this with a marker and a whiteboard, right? So let's point that out.
Yeah, I force people to tell me stories. I say, tell me a story in which this would lead to that. And if you can't come up with a plausible story for how this could happen, that's a pretty good indicator that they're not. There was some very strong correlation between who won the Super Bowl, whether it was the AFC or the NFC, and who won the presidency, right? Those two things do not actually interact, but there was a very strong correlation because the universe is very big, and with very large numbers, we see correlations that don't actually mean anything. So if you can't tell me a story about who wins the Super Bowl leading to who wins the presidency, then probably there's not a good story to be had there.
There are some wonderful blogs out there which actually compile all the wonderful correlations that have absolutely nothing to do with each other.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, I have a question for James. What do you think are the best data mining tools for content creators?
Best data mining? I would have to have more context around that question. Like, for what?
Say you have the op-ed videos. How do you determine when someone creates a video if it's going to get a lot of hits?
When somebody play, I'm sorry, when somebody, so modeling like predicting the number of hits a video gets.
Right.
So the guy who was just about to ask you a
where's
question,
Brian?
Where's Brian?
Brian Abelson, you should talk to him because he's much smarter than I am about that sort of thing.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks. I was just wondering your
I'm not,
perspective.
I'm not a data miner. Like,
okay.
yeah, so.
Okay, thank you.
Great. You can sneak.
He's a data poet.
Okay. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you. Great. Thanks so much.